Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another webinar in our series of webinars talking about growth strategies. Today, I've got Jeff Carbeck, our CEO, and we're going to be talking about how to prioritize and incentivize different growth strategies and growth opportunities inside of your business. I'm the marketing manager here at 10X, Dave Scott. And just a couple of parking lot items before we get started on today's webinar. Jeff will be available afterwards for questions. So if anybody has any questions, just try to keep them and we will get to them as soon as we can. If it's urgent and you have to jump off the webinar for some reason, just let us know by typing urgent in the comments below and we will certainly try to answer your question right away. If the audio and video is coming through okay, if you wouldn't mind, go to the chat box and let us know that. Let us know that you can hear us okay and see everything okay. If you have a colleague or a coworker or somebody in your space that needs to see this webinar, it will be recorded afterwards and we'll be placing it not only on our YouTube channel, but also on our Facebook page and our LinkedIn page. So there's a couple different places, a few different places that you'll be able to view the webinar afterwards. Well, that being said, Jeff, take us away.
Great. Thanks very much, Dave. And thanks all for joining this webinar. What we want to do today is talk about how we think of through prioritization and incentivization of growth opportunities. And they're really two different but related topics. And we spent some time in one of our past discussions around the prioritization step. And we'll talk just very briefly about that. And then we'll focus more on the incentivization piece of the process. So I am Jeff Carbeck. I'm the CEO of 10X, and we won't spend a lot of time on my background other than to say that, I've spent most of my career both developing and then commercializing technologies and then joining in the process of helping others do the same through our capabilities at 10X of advising and helping others develop unique business insights. So at 10X, just very briefly, what we do is provide insights through the development and deployment of customized teams of specialist consultants plus industry experts to provide exactly the kinds of unique insights that are required to address some of the questions we'll be talking about today. So let's dive right into it. When we think about the opportunity prioritization step, as we've discussed before, it's really both about looking at the opportunity from an outside-in perspective in terms of what is the actual opportunity in terms of size of market growth, profitability, and those sort of things, but also really how does it fit with your own organization. And oftentimes these two things get mixed. And what we really try and do at 10X is help our clients think about them as independent, but equally important criteria. So an opportunity can be attractive from the perspective of market size, market growth, profitability, segmentation, but it also needs to be a good fit from an organizational perspective. And this is really where internal strategy becomes a key player. So how do we understand how the ambition and the strategy of your organization intersects with a particular opportunity? And oftentimes this is the key dimension for making a decision. It's about having that outside perspective around the size and the growth potential and how it fits with your own capabilities, and making that assessment is really key. So oftentimes that decision has to be made in a time frame of weeks to justify an additional investment as opposed to a long-term business model development. And that's one of the things we really strive to do, is to help identify exactly what are the key criteria that would make or justify moving an opportunity forward, and then assessing that criteria in a way that helps drive those decisions around where you want to invest. The other thing is that we really want to focus on is the fact that oftentimes an opportunity that's attractive from a purely outside-in perspective, so it could be a big market with a high growth potential may not actually be an overall attractive or acceptable opportunity because of other dimensions associated with it, either as it relates to your own ambition around your growth strategy, or more importantly, things that may be required to activate that opportunity. And so that's really where we think the next sort of step in this process is important and comes in. So how do you start to think about a growth opportunity in terms of ease of execution? And not the fact that things need to be easy, but rather that things need to be easy enough, or the challenges need to be well identified and understood so that the appropriate investments can be made and the appropriate timelines can be constructed to enter into that opportunity. And for us, that's really one of the areas where we've seen many growth opportunities stall or fail, is when clients don't fully appreciate the challenge of entry into that space and the challenge of aligning their capabilities and their offerings with that space. And that really gets to the second part of what we want to talk about here today, which is how do we think about the incentives that are required to make people change their behavior to accept your offering or accept your new product into the market. And this ultimately has to feed back into the prioritization, because if there's not a clear market entry strategy in a clear way in which you can overcome those barriers, then the opportunity itself should not be prioritized. So let's talk a little bit about that in the context of prioritization, and then we can talk about it in terms of kind of the how to incentivization step that might be required. So in terms of prioritization, the thing we look at often is how segmented the market is. In other words, how many different players are there actually trying to provide the same or similar capability that you're trying to offer into that space. And the second is, what are the things that are required to induce somebody to change their behavior? In other words, what are the barriers that actually exist to drive changes in behavior? And so how we feed that into the prioritization scheme is to really look at who are the decision makers and how do they make their decisions about a particular offering. So one of the examples we've talked about before, I think, is one in which we helped a client who is developing a new material for making filters for hydraulic systems more efficient. So clearly making a filter that takes out contaminants and makes systems more susceptible to mechanical failure is a good thing, because you avoid downtime. But if your filter is better because you've got a better material in it, exactly how do you define that value, and how exactly do you capture that if you're providing that new material? And so one of the things that we helped our clients do is understand what the value of a better filtration capability is in different markets, and ended up focusing on the hydraulic fluids market specifically because we could tie the ability to filter out contaminants as a clear marker, or as a clear ability to maintain better uptime of equipment, which meant better production yields for things like mining and construction. So if you can tie the performance of the offering that you're providing in the market to some specific outcome in the downstream process, that's a huge advantage. And so tying better filtration capability to more uptime for mechanical equipment, and therefore more yield on mining and construction for the clients was a really key part of the prioritization of that specific segment for this capability of new filtration. But we then have to think about the incentive part, which is who actually benefits from that, and then how do you get them to help drive change? And that's really the second part of what we want to talk about today. So if you think about incentives, the question is, how do we convince people within the value chain of the production, say in this case of hydraulic filters, to make a change in behavior, and what are the incentives that would be required to make them do so? And in this case, the argument starts with, and it really always starts with, the value that we are creating with that ability. So in this case, the ability to improve the yield or improve the uptime for the construction equipment or the mining equipment, and that we could translate directly from the output of the machinery that was utilizing these filters. So in that case, what we can say is that the benefit, or the primary benefit, goes to the end user of the equipment. And so that meant that we would have to allow or provide the manufacturer of the ultimate filters to capture that value, and in capturing that value, then come back and drive demand for our clients' materials versus the traditional materials that they've used. And it's that insight, it's really that perspective across the value chain that's critical. So how do we understand what the ultimate end customer values? How do we understand how that value can be created or developed in terms of a business offering from their customer or their provider? So the provider of the filters, and then how does the ultimate value translate back to the provider of new materials for that filter application itself? And so it can ultimately be a little bit complicated and a little bit deconstructed from the actual consumer of the benefit. But understanding that whole chain and understanding how that value works is really critical, and it's really key to developing and building the overall business case for how a new product or new offering can be positioned in the market. So in this case, what we did is we advised our clients to work very closely with the production with the producers of the filters themselves, to create a new business model around how they would offer their filters, more around overall uptime for the equipment that they were selling filters for, and less around just selling filters by a unit price, and then capturing the value that was created by the improved uptime, which could be measured as a value back to our client, back to our material provider. So hopefully this is an example of where understanding the ultimate value in the market and who you have to incentivize to change behavior can translate into your strategy for entering into a market and your strategy for positioning yourself in the market. And in the end, what this leads to is a very different approach to providing materials. So traditionally, it might have been selling a material into a filter market where you price your material as a cost plus product. You figure out how much it costs for you to produce that material, and then you add your margin to it. And instead of doing that, you say, well, what value am I creating in the market in terms of improved uptime for machinery? And you say that value translates directly into the price of my product, and therefore I can achieve a certain price that's actually much higher than I would achieve using a cost plus model. So that's really what we wanted to focus on today, is this idea of thinking through where your offering actually makes or creates value in the end market with your customer. How do you think about that cost plus pricing, and how does it actually translate back into prioritization of an opportunity? So if there's an opportunity that not only has a high growth and large market potential, but also gives you an opportunity to think about things like value-based pricing, that can actually be a much higher priority opportunity than something that has a different growth potential, but maybe drives you more towards a commoditized pricing or a traditional kind of cost plus pricing. So I think that's really the key message we want to convey today in this webinar. And getting those insights can be quite challenging. It really requires understanding not only the value chain, but also understanding very specific buying and decision-making processes across the value chain, particularly where you think about where you might be entering. And so this is a place where that outside-in perspective can be particularly important, and where we think 10X can provide a lot of value. So hopefully that gives you some idea about how this topic is relevant to growth opportunities, and how 10X might be able to help in assessing it, and help in actually identifying those market entry points and those incentive requirements that make entry successful, and also help prioritize where you direct your growth opportunities.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and that totally makes sense. We have a question from Rob. Rob asks about the vertically integrated product or service. Do you have an example? He said, do we have an example of what a vertically integrated product or service might look like?
Yeah, I think a really great example is around battery manufacturing, right? So batteries have traditionally been a very vertically integrated offering, and it's been a place where providers of energy storage have taken advantage of a vertically integrated structure, and it's actually been a barrier, frankly, to innovation. And so it's one of these places where if you could create a new integrated structure around manufacturing, you could actually take huge advantage of the fact that existing structures are vertically integrated already, and create a new value, capture new value by the fact that you've broken through that structure and provided a new capability.
Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. We'll open it up here for a few more questions, and then we will adjourn and give everybody some of their time back. One of the questions we just got from Tina is talking about buying behaviors. What are some tactics, some best practices, she asks, around incentivizing using buying behaviors for ideal buyers?
Yeah, so really, trying to incentivize buying behaviors is really about understanding what's the value that your customer perceives out of what they're purchasing. So it gets back to something we talked, I think, a little bit earlier about around segmenting the market and understanding the buying behavior of different customers, and what do they actually expect from their purchase. And oftentimes it's not understood when you're selling a product into the market what your customer expects from the price that they're paying for your product. And it can be something they may expect more, and they may expect less. And so really understanding that whole process is understanding what the customer expects. So the example we've talked about before is there's a customer in the market buying components that go into a coating process of paint, basically for an application like an automotive application. Are they just expecting to buy the basic materials and they're going to formulate it and they're going to create their own outcome? Or are they expecting support in developing a customized formulation that actually can improve the overall performance of the product in the context of automotive painting? And if it's the latter, you can actually charge more by also encouraging and providing the ability to support that development of capability, versus another customer who may not expect any of that, and yet you may be pricing into it additional technical support, application support. And so it's really about ultimately understanding how your customer perceives the value that they're getting from your product offering, in addition to the actual raw material or raw product that they're getting. And then are you appropriately pricing that into your total offering? And like I said, it may be that you need to raise prices because you're offering more than just the product. It may actually mean reducing your pricing because all they really want is that product, and they're going to do their own development beyond the value that you create from just providing that raw material. So it's really about understanding your customer's behavior and about how they're going to use that material.
Makes sense. We have a question from John. John asks, when does it make sense to think about vertical integrations versus a networked environment like Apple and the Apple App Store?
Yeah, great question. So, it really depends on the particular value chain that you're in. And what we've seen is that you have to look at where that value is created. So there's really a waterfall analysis that's done between the raw component and material suppliers and the ultimate sale of the product to the consumer. And it's not just about cost, but it's also about profitability. And so if you build the overall waterfall analysis between the raw materials provider and the ultimate product, you can identify where not just the high cost players are, but also where the high margin players are, and then decide how much of that supply chain do you want to take on. And then the other decision is, really what is the cost of acquisition, right? So if you have to work upstream and acquire additional capabilities to provide those feedstocks, what is the transaction cost, and how does that add on to margin? And it's the same as a downstream in the downstream strategy. So you look at your downstream players and you say, how much additional value are they adding in terms of margin in addition to cost, and then deciding where you might want to make a play. So you really have to look at the whole value chain in terms of both cost and margin, and make a decision in that particular value chain where you want to play. And, at what degree can you make an acquisition, and with what overall sort of transaction cost can you make that acquisition to position yourself to be a more vertically integrated provider. So it's very, very dependent on specific value chains that we're talking about.
Makes sense, Jeff. Now, that was a great question, too. We'll open it up just for a couple more questions here. We'll give everybody about 10 or 15 seconds, and then we will wrap things up today and go from there. John says, thanks. John will reach out to you afterwards to make sure that if you have any questions, we answer them for you. Jeff, this has been a great spend of my time today, about 30 minutes. I appreciate it very much, and we appreciate everybody for joining us today. Again, the webinar is recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel and our social media channels shortly. If you have any questions, Jeff will certainly be available afterwards, and we will make sure that we send this out via email so you have his contact information. Jeff, any last parting thoughts before we adjourn for the day?
No, only to say that these are really, really, really critical questions and really critical issues around growth, and happy to follow up, and also appreciate people's time to gather some insights from us. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks again. Thanks everyone for joining us on today's webinar, How to Prioritize and Incentivize Growth Opportunities and Strategies. We will talk to everybody soon.